All right, I have the privilege of visiting with you for the next part of the program. I'll be talking about some selected agronomy and plant establishment factors. I have a fairly short presentation time, about 15 to 18 minutes, somewhere in there. And so I'll be giving some general information to lay the background for many of the other speakers, but I will have some information regarding some specific research studies that NDSU has done to address some items within this area of plant establishment. To begin, we do have a lot of references relating to corn that are available to you from the NDSU Extension Service. And one is a corn production guide. And this is a fairly new guide yet, and gives a lot of basic information that should be useful. There's another one which is displayed, and this is a guide on an overview of the growth stages and management implications for corn. So if you want to be good managers of corn, it's very useful to know the various crop stages and the associated biology and especially some of the management things that relate to the growth stages. So I'd encourage you to take a look at these as you prepare for the upcoming season. So this is actually a table that was found in the Corn Growth and Management Quick Guide. And I thought it'd be a good introduction on some of the critical times when our yield potential is determined. So as you can see, early in the corn's life, there's some yield potential that's being established. For example, at the V3 stage, already the potential ear number is determined. And then soon after at V4 to V5, the kernel rolls are determined. Corn has 3 root systems. We have the seminal or seedling root system. The next one is the primary root system called the nodal roots, and that comes into play and is primarily supporting the plant by the V6 stage. And then a third root system is the prop roots, and they usually occur later on in the vegetative stages, sometimes starting at the V12 to V14 stage. But also at that stage is when the number of kernels per row are determined. So all of this is potential. And as you're well aware, once we reach the reproductive stages, that's when we actually determine the yield on the corn, starting with R1 stage when silking and pollination begins, and then goes through until the R6 stage, which is physiological maturity, when we can find that black layer. So we won't go through these, just a quick review of the important vegetative and reproductive stages. So I like to display this chart when I visit with people about corn production. This came from the University of Minnesota, from the corn specialists from the U of M. And it's a nice listing of those considerations when establishing the crop that are really impactful on yield. And so by now you've seen the hybrid selection. Notice the high value on making the right selection of hybrids. So we won't go into this, but we just want to emphasize that doing your homework on hybrid selection on a field-by-field basis can provide some very high impacts on yield. Notice the balance of the factors are all important. A lot of them, based on this chart, have a single-digit impact on yield, but certainly that can vary. And so I did put an asterisk by some of the factors that I do want to talk about. I'll present some NDSU data to discuss these a bit further. But those would include uniform plant emergence, relative maturity groups, plant populations, and then I'll show a little bit of information on row spacing as well. I just want to emphasize that according to the Minnesota information, hybrid selection, crop rotation, and uniform plant emergence can account up to certainly a majority of the impact on yield. Most of you are very familiar with growing degree days. When people talk about growing degree days, they usually think of corn, and rightly so. You're also very likely familiar with the minimum and maximum degrees in the formula for determining the growing degree day accumulation on corn and the related growth stages. the second bullet shows a rule of thumb on the amount of the accumulated growing degree days for various various aspects of the vegetative stage of corn. For example, there's about 120 units plus or minus 5 required for plant emergence, and then another 85 units for each new leaf early in the vegetative stages, and then it decreases as we go further into the vegetative stages of corn. On average in North Dakota, corn has 18 leaves, but that'll vary, maybe less in the west, and certainly maybe more in the Red River Valley. And then a very simple chart that's displayed is based on relative maturities. Again, it's a rule of thumb, but most of you probably are growing 80 to 85 day corn. And so the numbers associated with silking and plant layer and black layer are actually pretty simple. In other words, if you're growing 80 to 85 day corn, on average, it'll take about 1,000 units to reach silking, and then another 1,000 units to reach black layer. And certainly that's going to vary depending on the season, on the actual hybrid, on your management practices, soils, etc. But some numbers pretty easy to remember for the relative maturities that are very commonly grown in this region. And then of course we have NDAWN that help you calibrate or calculate the growing degree day units. And so that's available. If you look in the applications section of NDAWN, you can find the correct spot to enter the data, the planting date for corn, and then it'll accumulate the growing degree days for you. Another electronic model that I think you'll find of interest, hopefully you've used it, but if not, check it out. It's called U2U, which stands for Useful to Useable. It's been developed from a research database in the north central region of the US, including North Dakota. It's very user-friendly. And when you open it up, you'll find a map. And so you can actually pinpoint where your fields are and then use the information. Very simply, you would enter the planting date of the corn and then also the relative maturity. And then it'll graph for you the projected growth stages, in particular the silking stage, and then also most importantly, the black layer. And so why would this be useful? It can be useful in using a couple of examples. One is last year we had a rather late year, and so people that were had delayed planting into May, maybe even into early June, they could enter a prospective planting date, and then also the relative maturity, and just see if the model would indicate that we have a reasonable chance of reaching a black layer before frost occurs. And by the way, as you've noticed on the graph, it'll show the long-term average front end and back end of the growing season and when frost occurs. And this would also be useful, especially over time, just to help you fine-tune your relative maturities for a particular field. Maybe you need to back off a little bit, or heaven forbid that we actually have time left over in the season for a little longer maturing hybrid. So a couple examples of where it might be useful, but check it out. I think you'll come up with some practical uses for this. It's not exact, but it'll give you a very nice aid in making decisions you need for management during the season. Okay, let's get into a little bit of agronomic information. We all know that we have water challenges with corn production. Sometimes it's excessive, sometimes it's hard water, in other words, hail. And then most often in our region, we see moisture stress. So that's why I put two pictures up. And Ryan will talk a little bit about this as well, especially in the western part of the state. So maybe you've seen this table before, but I wanted to bring this out just to show the impact of moisture stress, especially during the reproductive stages of corn. And so everyone probably knows that if you're a corn grower or advise corn growers that during the tasseling stage, VT through the R1 stage, silking and pollination is the most critical time to have minimal stress, including having as little moisture stress as possible. That's the time where we would see the greatest negative impact on corn yields if we have moisture stress at this time. But it continues. There's still significant yield reductions later on in the reproductive stages, milk, and actually even up until the dent stage. So we want to emphasize this because it's probably our #1 corn production challenge in North Dakota. And you need to figure out how to minimize this. Maybe it's a reduction in tillage. Maybe it's certainly hybrid selection. And there's certainly other management factors as well. One study that NDSU has been conducting at Oaks is looking at drought tolerance corn hybrids. We've done this for 2 years at Oaks. This is our irrigation research site. And to give you a glimpse of some of the work we're doing with drought tolerant hybrids. In this case, in the past season, we had 6 hybrids that we tested. 2 are non-drought tolerant and 4 that were. And essentially what we're looking at is just testing the performance of the drought tolerant hybrids compared to conventional hybrids, and then adding the irrigation component to see if we can manipulate the moisture to enhance the performance of these drought tolerant hybrids. And so the water regimes are as follows. Either we don't use any irrigation, just rely on rainfall, and then we use irrigation to provide around 50% of the total water needs of the crop, and then 100%. Or in other words, no water is not a yield reducing factor. And so at this point, we really can't draw any conclusions. We do have a written report on the study so far. It's actually in our Carrington Center blog. In a December issue, it was written by Mike Osley, our former research agronomist, and now he's our director. So if you're interested in that, you can go to our Carrington Center blog. It's called Center Points to look at that. But so just an example of some of our hybrid work that we're doing relating to moisture management. At the Carrington Center, we did a fair amount of work in a study, and this all came from a request from an extension agent, wondering how do we give precise recommendations on plant population based on relative maturity of corn. And so we did the work, dry land as well as irrigated. What I'm showing you is dry land work and emphasizing the plant populations, not planting rates, but actual plant populations. And so we had populations ranging from 20 to 44,000 plants per acre, and the associated yield average across the 3 years of the study, and 4 hybrids per year with the relative maturity range as listed. What we found was statistically, we maximized the yield starting at 28,000, and then it went all the way up to 40,000. So 28 performed as well as higher plant populations. Keep in mind the average yield in the study, and that may be considerably higher compared to further west. So I want to point out there's certainly need for this type of work in the west to fine tune plant populations that are likely less. They probably maybe they range from 18 to 24,000 as a common plant population, and with yields that maybe range from 80 bushel to 120 bushel. So just pointing out the need for research out west. Also in this database, notice that if you went to 24, there's very minimal loss in yield, only about 3%. But when we got to 20,000 plants per acre, then we got into double-digit yield loss. Okay, so 28,000 is a real good number to as a goal for plant population in our region. But there's more to the study, more results. And this is a look at the economics. So on this column, we show the cost of seed, and then we have in this row, the price of grain. And then in addition, we do have a split out by relative maturity ranges. And so as an example, using the data from the study, and if you use a cost of seed at $225 per unit and a price of $6, it might be a little bit conservative now, but we'll use that for easy math. We found using the database that the optimum economic plant population would be about 34,000 plants with the 83 to 85 day relative maturity. When we go with a longer relative maturity, note that the optimum economic plant population was actually less at about 31,000. So keep this concept in mind as we reduce the relative maturities. It's very likely you need higher plant populations. However, these populations are very likely high as we move westward in the state, and Ryan will discuss that a little bit more. So I just wanted to let you know this information is available if you're want to fine tune your information, in particular in the east central part of the state. A few years ago, we conducted a very extensive commercial cornfield study looking at the impact of early season plants on yield of corn. And so we looked at such things as of course, the actual plant population that was out in commercial fields, but more importantly, we were looking at impact of skips and doubles, and certainly the delayed emerging plants and their impact on corn yield. So it was extensive work over several years. This is a picture of a couple of the extension agents I worked with. They're very enthusiastic about this. It was a very good learning process, plus generating data to share with audiences. Both these guys are not with Extension anymore. We must have worked them too hard, but we generated some really good data. Here's a map in North Dakota showing the counties where the work was done. Notice the bulk of it was in the east central part of the state, but there was work in the west, even in Stark County, and as far north as Renville County. As you imagine, we generated a lot of data, but this is a fairly concise look at some of the more important data that we did discover. This work was done actually by a person working on their master's degree who was a former extension agent, but it did involve a lot of people, and one of the main priorities was to generate data to help people maybe fine-tune their corn establishment practices. So by now you've looked at this, note that this is relative weight of, it's not bushels per acre. And so here's, we use 100% for the normal emergent state. Notice the impact of late emergers. Just in general, 1 week of emergence, we found a dramatic reduction in yield, and delaying for approximately 2 weeks, even further, had a negative impact on yield. Also note that if we had plants next to a skip, there was an increase in yield, but certainly it didn't compensate for that loss of plant. Or if there was a plant next to a late emerger, that plant did perform better than average, but didn't compensate for the losses with the late emerging plant. So as a summary, very simply, anything you can do to maximize the uniform emergence of corn plants would be profitable. So it's up to you to figure out what you need to push that percentage up. If it's tillage systems again, or fine-tuning equipment, whatever it takes, it's certainly going to be profitable to have a very uniform emerging corn stand. Okay, we've done a little bit of work with row spacing. My experience is when people contact us, probably the number one question I have is on plant nutrition. But number two often is row spacing. So I want to show a little bit of work that we've done in the east central part of the state. This is a compilation of 8 site years of work that was done at Carrington and then irrigated work at Oaks. And we found simply that there was a very modest yield increase with 15-inch corn versus 30-inch. And notice that we had some fairly substantial yields in this database. Another database, it's 2 years of work at Carrington, comparing 22 to 30-inch rows. And note that with the yellow bars, which are the average, comparing 22 to 30-inch, that we had a little higher response in yield with the 22-inch compared to 30. And if you recall the table I showed you from Minnesota, the information from these two studies corresponds pretty closely to that Minnesota data on row spacing. So in summary, very modest yield responses with narrowing rows. So keep that in mind if you're considering purchase of new equipment to go from wide rows to something narrower. And the last subject that I want to mention is a little bit of work that we're doing with starter fertilizer. We've been doing work with phosphorus and zinc on a well-drained soil, generally with soils that have a low P level as well as low zinc, and our primary source of fertilizer was 1034-0. And so this is a summary of our work done essentially during the first decade. The major thing I want to mention is that when we banded the 1034-0 at rates typically 2.5 to 6 gallons per acre, we saw a 4 to 5% yield increase with either in-furrow or placing the band within 2 inches of the seed as compared to the untreated check. When we went to higher rates, 6 gallons per acre as a starter, as in-furrow application, we saw no additional benefit yield response compared to 3 gallons. Okay, my time is slipping away, so I'm going to move ahead. If you want more details about this work, we have it published in this reference. And if you do a web search, NDSU Corn P, this should be one of the first publications that come up for your viewing. And then recently we're doing work with zinc. And this is a compilation of 5 years of work comparing the in-furrow application of 1034-0 with zinc. And we're using a good quality product at 1 quart per acre. And notice we've bumped up the yield response by a couple of percentage compared to 1034-0 alone, again, as in-furrow application. And my final slide is a comparison with the 5-year average response with in-furrow zinc with 1034-0 versus applying the zinc as a foliar application. The zinc was applied at 1 quart per acre, and the foliar application was at the V4 to V7 stage. And notice that we did see a yield advantage with the in-furrow application compared to foliar. And that should do it for the prepared information I have for you.